Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the GovTech Advisors podcast. My name is Andrew. We on the other side over here, we've got Jordan, and we've got a very special guest with us today, Michael Flood. He is for those of you guys that don't know, there were two people that got me started in my EdTech education GovTech journey way back when I was in diapers. One of them was Robert Lacey. The second one was Mike Flood. And I'm just going to call him Flood because everybody calls him Flood going forward. And Flood is one of the smartest, most caring, and most forward-thinking people I've ever worked with in my entire life. And so we're really excited to bring him on here because for those of you guys that are passionate about not only GovTech, but EdTech, Flood's the guy. And so he is the SVP in charge of all things education at Khajiit, but he is also on the board of directors of COSN, which is the consortium of school networking. He's been there for many, many years, and he does a lot of other great things. So, but that being said, I'm going to do a really bad job of introing you. So, Flood, why don't you take the floor and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. That's a very kind introduction. I hope that I'm not that much older than you, that you were in diapers when we met.
Fair enough. Touche.
Also, one other update there. So I learned a lot and had a fabulous experience serving on COSN's board of directors. I actually just finished my second term. So that was 6 years on the board there, and deciding kind of what I'm going to do next in the nonprofit world outside of my job. But yeah, COSN's been very important to me. I've been involved with them, I guess, going back probably close to 15 years almost now as an organization. Wow. So, by way of background, I grew up in, kind of a divided family. Parents divorced when I was young, moved around quite a bit. My one half of that went kind of towards the low income side of the world, and the other half went towards the upper middle income side of the world, which was a big impact on me growing up, because I had a very diverse view of different segments of society in that, but also very easy for me to recognize the privilege that I had coming from my upper middle income side and everything that came out of that, in contrast to the people I was living with on the other side. So it was, and we can talk more about that, as this goes, but that influenced a lot of what drove me in life. And so went through, I don't know, probably a dozen or more primary, secondary schools, moving around. Ended up going out to San Diego, California, where I went to my sophomore and my senior year of high school, did my junior year abroad. And then I was a suicide application to Georgia Tech. So coming back to Atlanta, came to Georgia Tech, back to Atlanta, which had been my home for a lot of that time. And did my graduate work at Emory University, went into the telecom industry right out of college. During the dot-com bust, I graduated right when the dot-com bust was happening. So the first two companies I went to work for were hit by the bust. And so those jobs were very short, because it was kind of like you show up and then they either had to reorg or one of them went bankrupt. And it's, but then I was fortunate enough to be recommended over into Nextel. And that was kind of the start of my wireless telecom work, which I did at Nextel and Sprint and AT&T, and then the past 10 years actually now at Khajiit. And during that time, more and more focused on how we could use the technology to benefit kids and students and the education system and ultimately America's future. So I've been very passionate about it. Try and mix my off hours volunteer work with what I do in my day job, so that they help each other, but also both of them really serve my passions.
Sure. Well, so I know when we work together, and we still work together to this day on projects off and on, but in the past, we kind of talked about in using telecom and helping to empower and provide solutions in schools and school buses. But can you talk a little bit about a lot of people? I know Khajiit, in my household, it's a household name, but a lot of people don't really have Khajiit on the mind. But you guys do some very powerful things for the education space, and especially this past year. Khajiit really, what you guys have, it was almost like you guys were preparing for what happened this past year. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys did there, and kind of what you guys are continuing to do?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So You know, as you were kind of alluding to there, I think you and I met when I was at Nextel, and we were doing work already, or I was already doing work in the education space, and you were as well. But when I first got into wireless, everything that was going on in the wireless industry with regard to schools was all about the operations, the business side of a school and a school district. And so it was about helping them run their operations more efficiently, helping the school administrators. You know, we were doing BlackBerries back then. Here's my BlackBerry still sitting at my desk. But we were doing BlackBerries so that school administrators could get their emails faster. We were doing, you know, GPS and tracking on school buses to help operations route buses more efficiently. Once Nextel, just after Nextel was acquired by Sprint, and actually just a little bit before that, I had started to turn my attention to, you know, the core mission of the schools. You know, it's great that we're helping them be a better business, but that's actually not their core mission, right? Their core mission is to educate the future generation. It's really building the future of our country through all of the children in our society. And so when I had the opportunity after the merger at Sprint to step back and take a look at the entire education landscape, because I moved into a position, you know, that had that as its role, right? Looking at education strategy nationally, I realized that the 80% of our business had come from the Nextel world. And 80% of that was basically the push to talk radio traffic, right? And was all tied to operations. But there was already a vision emerging in the education space, which had started, you know, probably a decade or two before that, around one-to-one computing and making sure every student had access in the classroom to a computer, and therefore could start getting exposure to the internet. And that had such an impact on me in my youth that I was certainly inspired by that. And so what was just starting to emerge when Sprint bought Nextel, which would have been back in what, 2006, roughly?
Yeah, 2005, 2006.
2005 and 2006. Yeah. So what was just starting back then was this idea that wireless technology could start having a real impact on students. And back then, you know, we didn't have the iPhone yet. So a lot of these early projects, which were called mobile learning, were using Windows, you know, the Windows mobile operating system, if you remember that. It's not around anymore, but the Windows mobile operating system, even Palm OS and BlackBerry devices. So it was using those devices and allowing students to take those away from school with them and access resources and talk to their peers, talk to their teachers, and improve their education outcomes. And these were very small projects in pockets around the country. And so my focus really started to shift to that, was how can we actually use these networks that we've been building to connect students when they're not at school and really make sure that they have the full access to, you know, everything educationally all the time, everywhere. And so I ended up coming to Khajiit in 2011 because Khajiit gave me the opportunity to really build a business that would focus exclusively on that mission. And so, you know, Khajiit had been around since 2003, and they had been focused on connecting kids to with cell phones that had parental controls, so their parents could keep them safe. You know, who they could call, who they could text, what time of day, who paid for what, all that great stuff. And when I came to Khajiit, it was really in partnership with the founders of the company who realized that this connecting of kids was shifting to be more about data and the internet than about, you know, voice and text, which those old feature phones had been doing. And because in the feature phone world, it had been mostly about early adopters of giving phones to kids who were primarily upper middle income households, right? They had historically sold their product to families, upper middle income families, who were the early adopters of that. Now, what we were really focusing on with the education business was connecting the most economically disadvantaged students who didn't have access to this technology and doing it through those schools and libraries that really cared about serving that population. And so that's what we've been doing. So as you alluded to, 9 years before the pandemic, we were exclusively focused on connecting students to broadband when they were not in school. And then the pandemic hit. Right. And suddenly nobody was in school, and there was a much greater awareness of who needed to be connected to broadband.
Right.
So how do you...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Jordan.
No, go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to make a stupid joke of you were listening to that band before they got big. Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, you know, you bring up an interesting point, like the way education, the way business in general happened before the pandemic is quite different than what's happening today. and what's going to happen tomorrow, right? So
Yes.
how do you see the education space changing going into the end of this semester, right, and into next year? How do you see the education space kind of adapting to COVID and kind of beyond?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely, first of all, the world is forever changed. And I'll kind of touch upon a few things there. I mean, one, education at its heart is about preparing our kids for the future world they're going to live in. Well, the future world they're going to live in has changed. The workplace has changed, the work dynamic, where you work, who you work for, the amount of people who can now work remotely. I mean, when I hire new employees today, I don't even put a location for that job anymore. What does it matter? We're all remote anyway, and we've all learned how to work efficiently remotely. So that's going to open up so many more opportunities for people. And the way that they work and the importance of this kind of communication has grown tremendously. And so schools will need to continue to prepare students to live in that new world. In addition, teachers who, we always talked about pre-pandemic that there were teachers who loved technology, and then there were teachers who didn't love technology, and there were a lot of resistance, and they didn't really want to adopt the tools. And you'd have instructional design people who were trying to push these latest tools to the teachers, and they'd get pushed back and things like that. And, they didn't have that luxury of resisting the technology during the pandemic. There were some students certainly around the country whose only option was still paper packets that got sent home, and they had to do all their work on paper. And that was obviously a tremendously different learning experience than the students who were able to connect live in real time to their teachers every day. But more importantly, the teachers themselves and the schools and the district personnel, they all learn to leverage these technology tools, not just as an add-on to the core education process, but as part of the core education process. And so going into the fall, when it's now going to be back to, well, we could go back to mostly textbooks and paper and pencils, there seems to be a rising chorus of no. Like, now we know what we can do with these tools. We don't really want to walk away from them. Sure. And then the last piece of it that I'll bring in is there is right now, I'm hearing from state leaders across the country and people from other parts of the world, but even in my own local district here in North Carolina, there's a plan to continue to offer a virtual academy option forever. It's not going away, because there's 15 to 20% of families out there who are saying, you know what, my child has thrived in this environment. Maybe they weren't comfortable in the at-school environment in the past, and they became more comfortable and more outspoken and more engaged in the remote environment in their home, where they had a different sort of variables going on. And so because of that, while I think the vast majority of students certainly want to be back in the classroom, there's a healthy portion of students who actually prefer the remote environment. And so I think virtual school as an option is going to be here for the long term. And now we're getting to the point of asking, what does that really mean? And I think there's a lot more to think about there.
Sure. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that's kind of applied, because where I live in Florida, in Hillsborough County. And so they have a virtual, at any point in time, you can choose. This was before the pandemic. So here in Hillsborough, surprisingly, they were very forward thinking with that by being able to take that off the shelf. You're not part of the traditional school system in a sense, but you're still part of the county curriculum, and it's kind of administered a little bit differently. So talk to us a little bit, because I know, because we've worked together and I know some of the stuff that you're working on. Talk to us a little bit about how our states and local municipalities and communities, how are they kind of navigating this? Because I know that there's legislation that's being passed. I know that there's funding that's being asked for or being passed and kind of divvied out. And I can imagine in a lot of these communities across the country, they're saying, look, I want to do this, but I don't have the money for it. Or I'd like to do this, but I don't know how to do it. Or I don't even have the infrastructure in place to even support something like this. So how are communities kind of navigating that? And what are some of the things that you might be working on to help with that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So when we think about this digital shift, it's not just in education, although education is obviously something most Americans have some connection to. They either went through it themselves, or they have kids in the system, or family or friends who have kids in the system. So education is one we all know, but this is also going on in the rise of telehealth as a healthcare alternative. Now able to visit with your doctors remotely and not have to make that trip, which for some people just the trip itself was a barrier that they now can get around. Remote work, obviously we've talked about, many jobs now are doing increasing amounts of remote work. but access to a lot of other tools, resources, government services, and of course, plenty of entertainment options that are now proliferating.
I've got tons of those. I got too much of that.
Yeah, there's plenty of that too. So, so what that really brings it back to is, every citizen needs access to broadband and needs the tools and the technology and the skills, the digital skills, to be able to fully participate in that world if they're going to get all the rich advantages of it that their peers, their fellow citizens get. And that's going to drive our economy. It's going to drive our economic competitiveness globally. So cities, towns, counties, states, they're all thinking about this. I think, and broadband is interesting because broadband is a very unifying bipartisan topic. It's not, there is no, this side wants broadband for people and this side thinks that's a bad idea. No, everybody thinks it's a good idea. I think the differences tend to be more in like, how do we get there? What are the paths to get there? But when you look at the theme that has come out of this current administration, I think that obviously it's been more kind of the Biden administration's theme, but I think it's also very bipartisan, which is this build back better. Like we now need to build back the economy. So let's not build it back to what it was before the pandemic. Let's build it back to be something even better post-pandemic. And that does mean, let's get broadband out to everyone. Let's make sure that everyone has equal opportunity. Let's make sure that companies have now the ability to source even more qualified employees so that they can build businesses that are more competitive globally. I think there's a lot of agreement on the lifting of all boats that we can do right now. So as you mentioned, lots of funding coming out. There is funding specific to the EdTech world. Obviously, there's been lots of that as we've gone through the pandemic and going forward. But there's also the broader, infrastructure bills that are coming out right now that would, there's like the infrastructure bill currently proposed, in Congress and supported by the administration. That's $100 billion just for broadband, amidst the other things that are in that bill. So there's a lot of push to increase access.
How much, so in the past, the American Rescue Plan kind of changes things a little bit, right? That's direct payments for different groups. In the past, the education space has really relied on grants and things like that to fund different pieces of technology. So how much do you see kind of going forward, grants being still as available as they were versus more of these direct payments, say with the American Rescue Plan? How much, I guess the question is, how much heavy lifting and working do both the school districts as well as these companies have to do to find this funding now going forward?
Right. Well, let's think about kind of the broad, education budgetary landscape, right? The vast majority of school and school district funding is local, right? It comes from, either property taxes, sales taxes, state allocations, a combination of those. So the vast majority of that is local. The federal part of the education spending in this country has always been, I think, less than 15%. It's a very small amount. However, the vast majority of what schools pay for is payroll. It's people. Like that's where almost all of that money goes when you really look at it. So what you usually ended up seeing was a higher influence of those federal dollars on things that weren't just personnel. And so people tended to think of programs like Title I, all of the title programs, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all their various subparts, as significantly impacting the technology drive within education, because that was kind of the edge that the federal government could have a lot of influence on. And then, of course, E-rate itself, which was really fundamental since 1996 in building out connectivity to the schools, and then more recently building out the networks within the schools to make sure that every classroom was connected to robust broadband, right? So E-rate's been a huge funding source. So the reason I bring those up is that the state funding has generally been a sustainable source of funding, although we have seen the funding levels either not keep up with inflation in the past, 10, 20 years, or go down, and so there has been some reductions in that. Federal funding has generally been sustainable, but it's kind of just kept up with inflation, and it's tended to be around the edges. E-rate actually for its first, I think it was 20 years or so, was not pegged to grow with inflation. Now it is. That's something that changed under the 2 administrations ago, and so now it grows with inflation, but it's still focused on the campus at school. And the current debate going on, in fact, there's FCC activity going on right now to decide if E-rate should start to connect students outside school, because the recognition that so much learning is now happening, not just in the building, but outside school, and equitable education really means making sure everyone's connected. So what you alluded to with grants, corporate philanthropy and state grants and federal grants have always played a significant role in driving, especially new things in education, new things that needed to be tested, experiments and proof of concepts, and trying to scale up something. But it generally, a lot of the new things, which for all of us in the EdTech world, we're new in the multi-100-year history of the education landscape. We tended to see a lot of that grant funding as our source of education, because the sustainable funding was built around brick and mortar and payroll primarily, and the big operations expenses. Really what happened with COVID was these big injections of funding that came in through the CARES Act, through CARISA, which was passed in December, the budget reconciliation plan that went along with that, and then the American Rescue Plan that was passed more recently. All of those big injections of money, a disproportionate amount of that compared to history was actually focused on technology. And so now we've seen a lot of these one-time injections of funds come in for technology. And I think the question is, what is going to be the sustainable funding for technology on an ongoing basis? Because this big set of funding that's come in has really changed the landscape. And a lot of that is going to allow districts to buy things and purchase services and products that'll last them several years. But it doesn't change the fact that there will be a replacement cycle for the technology. There will be upgrades. There will be future needs. And so we really do need to get states and districts, and to some degree the federal government, to think more about the sustainable source of funding for technology.
Right. Well, because you've talked about the technology in outfitting within the school systems. We've talked about broadband, but there's that in itself is a multi-layered kind of discussion, because you're talking about broadband for the schools, you're talking about broadband at the children's homes that may or may not be there. You're talking about broadband and connectivity inside the different vehicles that they're going to. So the special needs buses, the general ed buses. So, there's so many different connection points, because to the comment you made earlier, depending on the socioeconomic ladder, they may have all these connections here, but then these people may have none at all. And so, where are, not just you and Khajiit, but where do you feel like the industry is going? Is more of this focus to drive the connectivity, to allow these kids, if they want to be remote or want to work in different scenarios? Is it, the school first? Is it the buses second, and then their kids home third? Or like, how are they figuring this out? Or is it different for every single district?
Yeah, so I'll give you 3 different paths that the future could take, right?
Okay.
So putting the futurist hat on, like, here's 3 different ways things could play out. One of them is that we stay the course, kind of where we were pre-pandemic. And what I mean by that is that the connectivity for broadband and technology is a gap filler. It's, let's identify these kids have it, these kids don't. Let's patch up the gap here and try and get the kids who don't have it up to some minimum that puts them at least at a basic competitive level with the kids who have everything they need, right? That's what we've done historically. And that's what Title I was built around, which, by the way, it had increases in funding during the pandemic, and the budget proposal that the administration just put out, their draft budget has a huge increase for Title I. So there could be a lot of funding around, like, let's get those gaps filled and keep focusing on filling the gaps. The second one, which again is still more specifically in the education world, could be just setting a new standard. And this is kind of where I hope that we're headed, which is a standard for the new education infrastructure, with certain basic premises that every student gets tools and resources that are equitable across the population. So it doesn't matter if you're high income or you're low income. When you enroll and the school gives you a computer, which I think they should be doing, they give you a computer. That computer built into it has anywhere, anytime access to the mobile wireless networks, right? Which is technology that now exists. And in fact, Google has really gotten behind this now. They put out a big, Google Education put out a big blog post, I think probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. And in that one, they talked about always connected Chromebooks and how they're really going to put more emphasis. I think they said there'd be over a dozen of these coming out this year, of these Chromebooks with wireless 4G LTE, built in the near future, 5G built into them as well. And really, when you talk to a student about what that means for them, it's really easy to watch their eyes light up, because you tell them, like, you've used a Chromebook before, right? And the kid says, sure, of course, I've used a Chromebook. Now imagine you could have that Chromebook anywhere you are, You could be sitting at home, you could be sitting in school, but you could also be sitting in a park or sitting on a camping trip, and you open it up and it just connects to the world and it works. And like their eyes just like, what do you mean? Like, I don't have to go find a Wi-Fi hotspot. Like, no, it's like built into the Chromebook. So that really can change the landscape. So I hope that every student will get a computing device with connectivity built in, and of course, all the appropriate software and training to know how to use that to be most effective. The third path, now we'll go down maybe, I don't know if you want to call it the most liberal view of where the world could go, but the third path is that this gets solved more at a complete national, all the way down to community level, where you think of like the Eisenhower project to build the interstate system. We actually decide to build internet connectivity to every single place in America, right? You know, this is the idea. I think some people in the current administration have already been pushing this, the idea that we should just connect at any place. Basically, their view is any place that gets electricity today should also have broadband, just period. Like we should, the electrification of the rural America, we should follow the exact same path, and we should have at least 100 megabit per second. Some people say a gigabit per second speeds anywhere there's electricity. And yes, that's a huge investment. It will take 10, 15 years probably to get fully built out. But that they're viewing that is the infrastructure of the future. The same way we think about electricity and water, we should be thinking about broadband. And so if we choose as a country to go down that path, it somewhat reduces the need for the schools to solve this on a per student level. But the reason I believe that middle path is the one we'll end up on is because I think people are tired of just trying to fill the gaps, and that's never really delivered true equity. And I think that even if people want to pursue the complete, version, that will take a long time. And in the meantime, I think the middle path is the right path, which is like every student should get a device with connectivity and be connected. And schools should just make that a standard part of their budget, the way that they budget. And it'll serve kids who are remote. It'll serve kids who are on campus but need to do homework. It'll serve everybody.
Do you think, Flood, so there's millions upon millions of businesses that are trying to sell to your plumbers, your HVACs, your transportation companies. You've got the GovTech 100, right? The companies that are doing the government thing. Do you think there's enough people focused on the education space for the needs and the market as a whole that really there's enough even technology out there and people focusing on it to solve and drive like long-term good solutions for forward like development?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because, first of all, if you just looked at the quantity of companies playing in the education technology space, I would say yes. The real trick to the education market in the United States, and this is different from much of the rest of the world, is that our market is incredibly fragmented, right? You look at the education landscape in the US, we have 13,000 or so school districts, independent units who make their own decisions, who each have an elected school board. So their decisions and their trajectory and their paths can change. Superintendent turnover in the United States is incredibly high. I think most superintendents, their around tenure is around 3 years. And then you have a new superintendent, so you have a new leader.
Wow.
So, compare that to like a company CEO, right? So compare that incredibly fragmented landscape, 13,000 locally elected school boards, each kind of charting their own course, to, countries that have like a Ministry of Education, which we only think about in terms of Hogwarts, right? But a Ministry of Education who kind of decides everything for the whole country. It's very, very different. And because the customer base is so fragmented, that has also led to the education technology industry being very fragmented in response. And it's both good and bad. It means that if a local school district knows a local company who's doing something innovative, it's much easier for that local company to break in and get into the market and do business with their local school district versus if they had to compete, for the whole national business like they would in some other countries. So there's a lot of companies in the edtech space doing a lot of innovative stuff. Most of them are quite small. There are, of course, some big players as well, but usually you'll see companies, once they get to a certain size, they start to do a lot of stuff outside of education too, and then education doesn't necessarily stay their big focus. So Amazon does amazing work in education. Google does amazing work in education. Microsoft does amazing work in education. Apple does amazing work in education. But education is not the biggest market for any of those companies.
Sure.
So we certainly see that that's a little bit different. Now, I would say that because of what's been going on with the acceleration of adoption of education technology during the pandemic, but even leading up to the pandemic, I think you're going to see a lot of additional, kind of business interest in the education market. For a long time, the education market was viewed, and if I put on my kind of realist hat, I sometimes get frustrated with it as well. The education market was viewed as just being a laggard in adopting technology. It was a hard market to do business in. Procurement processes are long, difficult, arduous, with lots of regulation and paperwork, and like you can't just walk into the, like you would the tow truck company you were talking about. You can't just walk in there, meet with the owner, and sell something. You have meetings and meetings and meetings, then an RFP process, and you got to have the right kind of contract vehicles, and you've got to meet these regulations. And so I think it's always been hard to get into the education market. Also, when you look at private equity, VCs funding ed tech companies, for a long time, education did not get a big share of private equity. We've now, in the past several years, we've seen the share of private equity focus on education really growing. And during the pandemic, we've seen some huge increases in private equity investment and valuations of ed tech companies. I think it wasn't too long ago, we had our first ed tech unicorn that came up. So, and not just in the United States, there are huge valuations on specifically ed tech companies coming out of China and India and other parts of the world that are going to be big competitors with America for future, global economic reasons. And they're investing in education. So, we obviously need to do that too.
So if I could ask you, take your Khajiit hat off and put your industry expert hat on, who are some companies that you're kind of watching and saying, I really like what they're doing? Who are some of these up and comers that you've really kind of been observing?
You and I are thinking like this, Jordan. I was going to ask the same question. I was like, what's the coolest thing that's coming up?
Well, you said that there's the first EdTech unicorn, so who is that unicorn? But who is the next potential ones behind it, if I could?
Yeah. So I'm gonna have to go look up the name because I can't remember the name of them of that particular unicorn, and this may be a bit of a hard one for me to answer because of the fragmentation of the market. But the types of companies that I'm seeing a lot around right now. So first of all, there's a big push around skills development. So when we think of like the history of education, it was always about, what do you know? You learn your facts and figures, you learn your basic processes, you take tests and you demonstrate you've acquired that knowledge. And like, that was the way it worked. Soft skills were never kind of a focus of the grading mechanism within schools. We've been talking about 21st century schools well into the 21st century. We were still talking about the need for 21st century skills. And yet we've never really had a grading rubric outside of some very, some very pocket examples, like the New Tech High School model that actually had a grading rubric for 21st century skills. But there's a lot of new companies developing software applications to help measure and develop soft skills, to help schools quantify that, and they plug right into their LMS systems. We're seeing a lot of that. There's still lots of school districts in the medium to small size that have not had comprehensive LMS systems that are now adopting those, and they've needed to during the pandemic. So these are the core platforms within a school district that help them keep track of all the classes the students are enrolled in, the parent and student and teacher communication, the syllabuses, the assignments, turning those in, pushing out materials digitally, all of that stuff around managing the students' academic career. That's growing very quickly, and there's more companies I think coming into that space. I'm trying to think of like who's sexy, and I don't know that the pandemic has really given us an opportunity to find out like sexiness as much as practicality. So like we've certainly seen, Zoom wasn't a name in education before, Zoom meetings like this, but they're big now. Microsoft has made huge investments there, through Teams. Google has made big investments with Google Classroom and a lot of things going on there. So I don't know if I have a great answer to your question there, though, of like who's the sexy company in the education space.
I think you nailed it though, because of course I've been watching this too, and my kids have doing stuff virtually, but I have seen kind of these really innovative or very forward-thinking, I'll call them enterprise or private sector technology companies, and people adopting Zoom. Zoom is a great example. Teams is another great example. And so it's like they're saying, hey, we can take these that we never thought about using them for kids. We never thought about using them for education. Well, why not? We just had to make a couple of changes, and then there you go. And so I think it's great, because one of the whole reasons that we started this podcast and this journey was to get more people excited about getting into government and taking some of these really great ideas that they're talking about selling to Fortune 500 companies and selling it to parishes and
Mhm.
other communities and bringing it there. So I think you've nailed it. So
Well, let me add one other thing though there, Andrew. So
Sure.
one area that I don't think it's fully emerged yet, but which I think is going to really start to emerge over the next 12, 24 months is really in the analytics space. So there's been some work done around analytics in education so far, but not a lot in honesty. And it's a tough market because you have to have really broad visibility and deep into like a student's learning process while still respecting student data privacy. So that's like, there's some tough, pieces there that you have to bring together. But the big question that a lot of people are asking right now is, we've been rapidly adopting a lot of education technology, especially during the pandemic. What works? What really works? What has a really lasting positive impact? And the need to understand that, what was used, maybe, and a lot of things, by the way, teachers used a lot of tools this year that they found on their own, that the school didn't tell them to use it. They had a problem, they needed to solve it. Everybody was super busy during the pandemic. So they went out through their own network, found a tool and told their kids, hey, here's what we're gonna use. So in some cases you have districts that have schools or schools that have teachers who are using something that they don't even know about at the higher levels. So I think a lot of them are trying to get a grasp around, what have we used? What kind of an impact did it make? And therefore, is that something we want to keep using going forward? Or is that something that served us during the pandemic, but now we don't need? And so some companies like Learn Platform, Catch On from ENA, which is a fantastic, ENA, by the way, is Education Networks of America. Catch On is a really fantastic tool that they have. ClassLink and Enive. Those are all companies that have really started to help schools analyze the data of what's going on in the online part of the school environment. What are kids doing on their devices? What applications are being used? How often? When? And at the same time, sometimes providing some very pragmatic benefits back to the school district. Like, you're paying for 10,000 licenses to this platform, but only 200 kids at this one school actually use it. So you can get rid of 90% of your costs there by just recognizing who's really using it. Or if it turns out that those 200 kids using it are doing some amazing stuff, now you need to transfer those behaviors to these other schools who just haven't adopted it, right? But you only can make those decisions and save money or drive better adoption if you have the information. And so I think education analytics as a category is going to see some rapid growth.
Well, because you bring up a good point. Sure, it's easy. Well, let's say it's easier to say, hey, you're using all this stuff, and I can say who's using it, who's not. But then taking that data and saying, okay, if they are using it, is it having a good impact? Because I dabbled in doing some research in analytics, over the past few months, and so it's not so much, hey, can you get all the data points and kind of put it into a big data lake and then analyze it and normalize it, but then it's like, who are you going to actually find that actually knows the question to ask of the data to get the answer that you would actually want? And so that's almost equally as hard of, who do you even turn to say, okay, I've got all this, I want to know the impact of X, Y, and Z, and then going in and using a data scientist to kind of put it all together.
Right.
Because there's probably hundreds of questions to ask of the data.
And as you can imagine, this is another one of those areas where education is going to have a hard time. It's going to be tough for education to keep up with the rest of the world, right? Where we talk about they've lagged behind in technology. And one of the reasons for that is they compete for human resources.
Sure.
And so, we've got 13,000 districts. They can't each have a deep expertise in data science. There aren't that many data scientists out there, and they're all being bought up by private industry right now anyway, who want to do data mining for other reasons. So it is hard, and knowing what questions to ask and how to ask those questions so you actually get statistically relevant, answers that you can rely on and make decisions on, that is really important. So I think companies, and that's why I brought up Enive as an example there, that they have a data science expertise. Learn Platform, which is based here in North Carolina and Raleigh, where I am, they have a data science expertise. So I think companies that are bringing some of that data science skill set to districts as a service, I think you'll see some growth there. But again, the tough challenge is, how do you gather all the data you want to gather and respect student data privacy correlate all of that to actual student records of student outcomes while respecting student data privacy. Like, there's a lot of questions there, and it's harder than just if you're a business and like, you run a retail store and you want to gather all the data on your consumers and who's coming in and out. Like, you don't have to think about that as much. But when we're talking about our kids and we're talking about how parents care about their kids and the data associated with them, it is a bit tougher.
Well, and then as soon as you say that, I immediately think to all the different ed tech companies that are out there and then coming out there. So then it's how do you get access, grant access to get all that data? And some of them, and I know a lot of them, some of them are not even in the cloud right now. So some of them don't even have APIs. I came across a couple not that long ago that it was like, it was going to be a lot of heavy lifting to just get the data that they needed out of the system. And so, yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, cloud and APIs, I mean, those are both, those are, to me, they're almost table stakes now. I'm surprised, that we have so many, but again, education lags behind for a lot of reasons. Mm-hmm. When you look at a lot of, it's interesting, the middle tier of districts are probably the ones who have moved the most to the cloud, because the big districts built big data centers back in the day. And a lot of them still own and operate and run these big, data centers of their own. And they don't necessarily need to go to the cloud as quickly as some of the others. And then the small districts, like the small districts, they don't necessarily need a broad scope of services. And so they don't really necessarily need to go to cloud solutions. They can get by with like things running out of Excel, for the level of analytics they do. I mean, I'm talking about school districts that have less than 1,000 students, which there are many in the United States.
Yes.
So they don't necessarily need it either. So really, it's a lot of those mid-sized districts who have been moving into the cloud faster. But when we talk, so for example, when we were connecting students to broadband during the pandemic, right, coming back to that issue, there were two methodologies that were generally used out there in the market to make sure students were connected and make sure they were connected safely and securely. And one of them was you connect the student and you tunnel all their traffic back to the district. And that way the district has a web filter and has a firewall and, has all the things that they would do to protect that student when they're at school. So by tunneling all their traffic to the school, you can give them that same protective environment, right? So that's one way they did it. And then of course, Khajiit does it a different way, which Khajiit connects them directly through our filters and firewalls, which we provide as a service to 3,000 school districts, out to all the resources on the internet. And what we really found was a lot of districts, were happy not only to use our service, but liked our service because there was nothing on the district network the kids needed to get to. When you actually ask them, like, what's the destination your kids are trying to get to, all of the applications they want to use are in the cloud. They don't need to go back to, it used to be like, oh, well, there's an FTP server at the school that I need to go get some files off of. Like, that doesn't exist anymore. Even their SharePoint is up in, Microsoft's cloud on Azure, right? So like, there aren't resources that they need to go to the school district network to get. So the destination is really up in the cloud.
Well, so you touch on something really important, because if you're providing connectivity to the school districts and Khajiit has a platform that's filtering out, different things, I'm thinking about this for my own kids. So is there content filtering based off of age level? So like certain smaller children can access only a certain level. High school, of course, they're going to be talking about and learning about maybe things that are more appropriate for their age. Does it scale up like that?
Yeah, it can. And I think that's very important. Like differentiated filtering, the ability to differentiate your filtering for various reasons is I think still really in its infancy, but I think it's really critical. So for example, in our platform, every district that starts with us, we give them some standard filters. We give them a K-8 filter, which we sometimes also used to call young students, right? And then we give them a 9 through 12 filter, and then we give them an adult filter, which is their staff, who use that. And so that's like the starting point. But those can be customized further from there. So some school districts think social media is fine, but only at the high school level. Some districts don't want social media at all. Some districts will say, well, I want to create another level of filter for content that's tagged as sexual education, because I only want that sex ed content, available to people who are actually enrolled in sex ed at the moment. It really does vary. And this is actually an area where the federal government was pretty smart. They passed a law a number of years ago called CIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act. And this is a law that requires that when schools are providing, computers and network access to students, they need to protect them from harmful content on the internet. And so, harmful content, there's a lot of ways to interpret that. I mean, we can all think about sites that, drive drug use or drive pornography or, hate speech and things like that. We can all kind of set some thresholds of like, these are inappropriate for minors. But then there's a lot of things around the edge, and you'll have districts who make very different decisions. One district might think that LGBT sites are risky. Another district might think that, gun manufacturer websites are risky, and they might make different decisions. Well, the way that the federal government wrote the SIPA law was that you, a district, have to have a mechanism to decide what's appropriate and then to enforce it. We're not going to tell you what's appropriate. That's your job, but you have to do it. And so that was a really smart way to write the law, because, we in our platform, when Khajiit's providing connectivity, we allow each district to customize those filters to make it what they feel is educationally appropriate. And that's really the true compliance of SIPA. So, just having a one size fits all, every student in the nation gets the same filter, like that's not SIPA compliant, in my opinion.
Right. Let me ask you with the filters, because we're talking about the content, but as with the Khajiit platform or with them adopting broadband, are you guys also filtering out harmful and malicious type of content as well that may be able to, viruses or phishing?
Yes.
Or is that, you are?
Yeah, so there's multiple layers in the system, right? So a web filter is really like your first basic screen. That is, the kid types in www.playboy.com. We should shut that down. Like, that's easy. Anybody can do that.
Right.
But beyond the filters, you go into the protocols that the traffic is using. So there's different protocols besides just your HTTP web traffic. So you go into the protocols, and then you go into the actual application signatures. So for example, when you use Facebook or YouTube on your smartphone, it's using that app on your phone is using a proprietary protocol that those companies developed. So it's not web traffic. A web filter wouldn't catch it. You have to catch that in more of like an enterprise security platform, a firewall type system that can recognize the different signatures of different traffic. And then if you decide to block it, can block it for you. And so we do a lot of that. So part of that is protecting students from harmful content. Like in those signature scanning, we're catching signatures of botnet command and control, viruses and malware, things like that you cited. But we're also sometimes catching things that are just not educational. And therefore, if the school's paying for that connection, it doesn't make sense for the school to pay for it. So during the pandemic, of course, we saw a huge surge in Xbox and PlayStation attempts, which is something that we block, right? But if you weren't built to block that kind of traffic, the kids are like, hey, I've got an internet connection. I'm stuck at home. This is what I'm going to do.
Sure.
As I've often told school administrators, like a kid who's at your school is a student. A kid who's at home is a kid. And you don't treat them the same way because their behaviors aren't the same.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So are you finding that for those school districts or communities that are leveraging, and we'll just talk about Khajiit because I know that you have a lot of experience there, are they allowing them at certain times to use the connection kind of independently outside of just for learning? Just so for those lower income or not as privileged, do they have the ability to use a Khajiit connection like a normal connection?
Yeah, so that's partially up to them, depending on what service they pay for and how they want to configure the policies for their account, right? So even before the pandemic, years ago, when I was still living in Georgia, we were working with a district, and they had a service from us. It was designed just to connect their K through 12 students, and we were managing that for them fairly closely. And we went back to them at one point and we said, hey, we've got this, this example of a student where all the traffic is going to a college program. Like clearly this is one of the parents who's enrolled in a community college program and doing continuing education. And we thought we should ask you about this because it's not K through 12. We could block it, but what do you want to do? And the district said, no, don't block that. Like we're absolutely fine with their mom being enrolled in that course. And they knew who it was. And they're like, yeah, we're good with that. No problem. But they could choose to do that. And maybe that choice is more obvious if it's somebody, out watching ESPN, or if it's somebody, off engaged in online gaming, but maybe it's less obvious when it's accessing other government services or, healthcare or continuing education, and it's actually up to whoever's paying the bill. So if the school district's paying the bill, it's really up to them to decide, what they want to allow, what they want to pay for.
Right. But I think it's super great that you give them the flexibility to give that option. And I think there will be districts that'll say, yes, I am okay with footing the bill to provide those types of things. And I think it's incredible. Jordan, I cut you off. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Flood, if you were to say, so if somebody's watching this episode today and they say, hey, I want to get into the EdTech space, I've got this cool widget that does this. In your opinion, where would somebody start? You had mentioned it's so fragmented and such like that. Where would a new company that's trying to jump into the EdTech start, in your opinion?
So this is where the fragmentation is really actually a benefit to startups, is there are lots of startups. So starting is easy. It's kind of making it past that chasm stage, getting to a substantial size that's hard, right? But starting is easy. And where you always start is you start with a real implementation. There are obviously lots of startups who, focus on like building and always trying to get it to be just right, but they don't get around to actually implementing it. And in the education space, that's actually something where you have more opportunities. So like reach out through your own network, right? Understand where you have people who are in the school system. It could be a teacher, it could be a principal, it could be an administrator that works in the district where you live, where your company's headquartered, or somewhere else in the country that you just have a personal connection to through your network. But find someone who's willing to try your product and use it in practice. Get it used in practice. That's where you actually learn what matters. And that's where you develop a story that you can then take to the next one and the next one and the next one. And it is really building upon successful stories where you had measurable outcomes that really drives a company in the education space. And the nice thing is it's easy to get in, and you'll see a lot of companies. There are lots of companies out there, by the way, who may only serve for the entirety of their company's history 5 districts that are like right around their headquarters. And they just got a nice little business and they're content to stay small and they help their local district, and that's all they want to do. And that's good too. But really for any company to grow in the education space, they have to actually show real implementations and what impact that made. And so get some beta users in, get some of your friends and connections in to use the platform, even if you have to give it away at first, but get some stories under your belt so that you can then understand the business case that you can take to those commercial customers you want to say, here's the value we were able to show in these tests. And that's why you should be willing to pay whatever you want to pay for this particular product or service.
Yeah. So Jordan, I know what you're thinking. So for those of you guys that are listening to the podcast, and this is maybe the first podcast you guys have listened to, I would highly encourage you guys to go to episode 2 of our podcast with Jack Siney, where he talks literally verbatim what Flood just said. He didn't know this, and he gives you the mechanisms of exactly how to do what Flood is suggesting to do and all the different ways you can navigate that. Because it's really, really important. And it's how you get started and how you kind of build from there. So it's super great advice, Flood.
Yeah. Now, let me add one other thing. So the other thing you want to understand is you want to learn the market. And lots of people who may be watching this just want to learn the market, like who's out there, who's doing what, et cetera. The classic place to do that used to be some of these big conferences, and conferences have just been, really difficult during the pandemic. I'll just leave it at that. Very difficult. But ISTE has always been, International Society for Technology and Education. That's always been a fantastic conference to go to with a huge number of participating exhibitors. Even just reading through the session agendas on that, you'll hear so many company names and you'll see which ones come up over and over again. And if you're not in the education world, you may have never heard of these things, whether it's like Schoology or Schmoop or, all these other names that you may have never heard of. But you'll see teachers giving presentations talking about what they loved about these platforms. And if you see the same ones coming up over and over again, then you're like, I should learn who those folks are. And then just looking through the trade floor, even if it's a virtual trade floor, in this year, but back to when we get to a physical one, walking that floor, I do it every year. Because we have a booth, and I have staff who are working that booth. And I usually spend a lot of time working our own booth too. But at some point I had to tell them, okay, y'all have the booth. I have to go walk this trade floor. And the ISTE trade floor is big enough that usually spans over 2 days for me of actually walking that floor and looking at every company and learning new ones, because there's always new ones in there that are coming up and growing. If you're a little bit past that first startup stage, and you're kind of looking now to accelerate. So like you've got something, it works, you've proven it, but you're like, how do I, grow faster? Then that's where I would look at some accelerators or some contests or incubator type programs And even SETA, the State Education Technology Directors Alliance, they actually have an emerging partners program where you have to apply and get in. It's very low cost compared to being a SETA partner normally, but their whole goal is to scale up what works. So if you have something that worked in your state and you're now at the stage where you're like, I want to take this to more states, SETA, which is a network of state leaders, is a great way to do that.
So I thought I knew a decent amount about EdTech, but Flood does a very good job of letting me know that I'm still in my infancy with this, because I learned a ton today. And one of the things that I learned, I think everybody's going to take away from this, is that there's some really big decisions that need to be made. There's a lot of help that these communities need, and there's not a single group out there that's really cracking the code. So we need help, especially for our communities and for our children. And so I hope that people that are listening to this today got some ideas, got inspired. So before we wrap up today, Flood, is there anything else you think our audience should know, or is there any other place that you think that you would like to point them to after they get done listening to the podcast today?
Well, some other organizations that would be, good to know and get connected to. COSN, of course, which, I served on their board, so I should mention them. That's the Consortium on School Networking. They are the professional organization of CTOs in the education space. So fantastic organization, very technology oriented, great place to learn about what's going on in the market, because they actually view corporate members as members, not as vendors or exhibitors. And so you fully participate when you're affiliated with them, which is really helpful. So COSN would be one to look at. In terms of other things like coming up, in the technology landscape, as we return to normal, the trajectory that we're going to get back to, some of the technologies growing there will be around VR and AR are certainly going to be growing a lot. Some of us may have read, hopefully you read and didn't see the movie Ready Player One. But there's some great future visions there for what we could do with VR, and augmented reality has some really great opportunities there as well. The military is actually adopting VR and AR in a huge way. A huge contract that just got signed for the military with Microsoft for HoloLens. So there's a lot of that's going to grow, and then AI. AI is the next step after you gather all the data, as we talked about. You get all the data into a data lake, and what do you do with it? Part of that is the point decisions you make. But AI actually starts to give you the ability to automate a lot of that decision making and learn itself as a system from the decisions that are being made to drive best practices. And that's what we'll get into, recommendation engines that help students know what their next learning path should be, or understand this student learner learns better this way than that way. And so we should redesign the delivery to really help them progress faster. AI is going to play a really big role in that. So those are all, newer up and coming technologies that I would suggest taking a look at.
Yeah. So one thing, Flood, I'll ask you that I asked one of our previous guests. So if somebody sees this episode and says, love what Flood's doing, love what Khajiit's doing. I live in, South Dakota, right? Mm-hmm. Is Khajiit hiring and looking for people where they should reach out to you if they love the mission or have experience in that? Is Khajiit somewhere that they can, or somebody that they could reach out to express interest?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we love external connections. We are hiring. You can find Khajiit listings on Indeed and on LinkedIn and on WorkScene. We have a dedicated site on WorkScene. So there's lots of Khajiit positions that we're hiring for as we continue to grow. And some of those as we move into additional, technology areas too, which can be pretty exciting. And then in terms of connecting with us, if you just think that, there's a way we could benefit your local community, absolutely, reach out to us. Our website has lots of information. Of course, folks can always reach out to me directly if they want to as well. I'm on LinkedIn or my email, mflood@khajiit.com. I can always get them to the right people in the company based on where they are and what they're trying to do. And we're growing internationally now as well. So, we launched in Canada before the pandemic, and we've been able to have a great impact up there. We're actually launching in Europe now. So starting in the UK and then expanding out in Europe. So we're growing internationally, in addition to the growth we're seeing here in the US. But we now have deployments in every single state in the United States and DC, of course, not just continental, Alaska and Hawaii as well. And we have deployments in every province in Canada. So we've been growing quickly, geographically, as well as, the overall size of the company.
Right. Well, and for those of you guys that don't know Khajiit, the reason why they're growing so quickly is because they're amazing. So what I'll do is we will put the links in the description. And then we are going to be posting this out. We'll have Flood tag. So if you want to start following him, because he does talk about a lot of great things, or start talking, that'll all be there. But I know that I know we took a lot of your time today. So thank you for making time for us, and thank you for coming on to the podcast. And we look forward to continuing this education conversation, this EdTech conversation. So with that being said, we're going to wrap it up. So for Mike, thank you so much. Jordan, it's always good to see you. Even though I see you every single day, it's good to see you every single day.
It's the first time on a Saturday, though, in a long time.
Well, hey,
thank you for accommodating me.
People didn't know that this was Saturday.
Now I give away.
That's fine. That's fine. No, absolutely. You giving us the time is great. So, but that being said, this is the end of our episode. So thank you guys for tuning in for another episode of GovTech Advisors, and we'll talk to all of you soon. See ya.
Thank you.